in pain and through tears from our homes in the US felt a sense of vulnerability that we hadn't felt in close to 80 years. We know that the landscape has changed for us, just as much, perhaps, as it's changed for our brothers and sisters in Israel. We feel, many of us, a level of vulnerability that we hadn't felt before, living as Jews in the United States. But something is very different than it was back in the terrible days of the Shoah. We now have a proud, not humbled, but strong state of Israel to defend the Jewish community worldwide, and that keeps us strong. And things are different in America too. We have communal power and a communal infrastructure that enables us to advocate for ourselves, to advocate for our brothers and sisters in Israel, and to advocate for and support Jews worldwide. Strengthening us in this important work are some of our wonderful communal organizations, headed by the AJC, American Jewish Committee, and we are so proud and pleased to have Arnie Herz here from AJC, who's going to speak to us tonight and let us know the role that we can play in supporting this important endeavor to strengthen the Jewish people and to strengthen the state of Israel. Because the truth is, it's not just Israel that's different, because Israel now exists and is strong and can defend itself. It's not just the job of Tzahal, our brave soldiers and the IDF. It's not just their job to defend us. It's not just the job of the Israeli people to stand strong for Jewry worldwide. It's not just the job of our Jewish elected officials. It's not just the job of organizations like AJC. It's not just the job of our rabbis and our cantors and our synagogue presidents. It's a job that's incumbent upon each and every one of us to stand up proudly and strongly for Israel and for the Jewish people, and to arm ourselves with the information that we need to counter damaging narratives about Israel and Judaism. In Parshat Yitro, the parsha that we read this week, that we will hear on this upcoming Shabbat, we hear the powerful story of how the Israelites received the 10 Commandments, the cornerstone of our brit, our covenant with God, at Mount Sinai. And the rabbis hasten to tell us that these 10 Commandments were given to every single Jew, every single Israelite. God gave them in a language that everybody could understand, and every person, man, woman, and child, every individual, was equally responsible for keeping these commandments. So it is with our Jewish community today. Every single one of us is responsible for being a chayal, being a brave soldier in the fight against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And when we get overwhelmed with all of the counter-narratives and we think to ourselves, how can we do this? How can I raise my voice in support of Israel and the Jewish people? Then we have our wonderful communal leaders to help us craft the speeches, the information, the words that we need in order to stand strong for Israel and the Jewish people. And that's why we're so grateful to Arnie and to his colleagues from AJC for being here tonight to give us the tools that we need to speak up proudly for our people and our land. Arnie Herz is with us tonight. He's served as president of the AJC Long Island Board from 2019 to 2023. He sits on AJC's National Policy Commission and National Board of Governors and has traveled extensively on AJC missions abroad. When he is not with AJC, Arnie has a thriving business, trademark, and entertainment and media law practice with a focus on day-to-day legal matters as well as highly complex disputes. He is a court-appointed mediator for the federal and state courts in New York. As a professional speaker, Arnie has delivered over 100 programs and keynotes on topics related to the attorney-client relationship, negotiation, and conflict resolution. Arnie, we're so grateful that you have brought your knowledge and your expertise to Temple Beth Shalom tonight, and we're so excited to learn with you. Thank you, and welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi, and welcome everyone. So as I was in the other room preparing, I was scanning through X, formerly known as Twitter. I don't know why they always have to say that. And I got some good news. I came across a white supremacist website that said that there is no anti-Semitism, it's just made up by the Jews. So I said, fantastic. I don't have to teach anything about anti-Semitism. It's all made up. So we're going to talk about who do you think is going to win the Super Bowl in 2 weeks. The Chiefs. Okay, good. All right, so we all agree on that. And look, it's a serious time. It is a very, very serious time. We have over 100 hostages, innocent people, just like us, who are hostages, including some very young children. A 1-year-old just turned 1 year old. We've got soldiers whose lives are on the line constantly. And as the rabbi was pointing out, this is a war on multiple fronts. There's the military battle. Then there's the battle to just keep Israel functioning and to support the soldiers. Things that we take for granted, or I at least took for granted 2 weeks ago, I just made the assumption that these things were happening, like the soldiers would have all the supplies they needed and all the equipment they needed. But my wife, Suzanne, who's here right now, who's also on our AJC Long Island board, just came back from a week-long or 9-day-long trip to Israel. And she met with former hostages, wounded soldiers, volunteered in agriculture, volunteered in a center that was preparing meals for the soldiers 2 miles outside of the Gaza border. None of this was done by the government. This was all supplied by the Israelis and volunteers like Suzanne. It's amazing. She met with a soldier who's recovering, who's wounded, and he wants to go back into battle, but he doesn't have combat boots. So Suzanne and her friend Hetty, who she went with, bought him a pair of combat boots for $350. She also learned that there's a lot of tunnel entrances are booby-trapped, and many young soldiers have lost their lives. And that in order to prevent that from happening, Israel has drones, tiny drones that go in to scan to determine if it's booby-trapped. But the problem is they are out of batteries in Israel. It's amazing. So while Suzanne was in Israel, she was buying batteries and having them delivered to the house, and I was giving them to people who were going to Israel to shuttle them over to Israel to deliver them to Ben Gurion Airport. Something as fundamental as that. And the reason why I bring this up is this. We're going to talk about the intellectual Iron Dome. And it's very, very important to understand the myths and the misinformation that's being shot out. Each one of them is like a missile. And like the Iron Dome, we need to be able to identify the ones that are dangerous and shoot them down. And like the Iron Dome, there's some that are not dangerous and not worth our energy, and they just fall in the open field. The Iron Dome does not shoot down every missile. And it's important for us to have that to be effective advocates, but it's also important to make a tangible impact to what's actually happening in Israel. Some people are just caught up in the intellectual exercise of playing cabinet minister to try to figure out what Israeli government should do or shouldn't do, and that's all fine and dandy, but we also need to remember that there's real people with real problems that really need our help. So kudos to you, Suzanne, and kudos to the rest of you who have gone. How many people here have gone to Israel on a solidarity mission? 1, 2, 3, 4, numerous people. Thank you very, very much. And after the program, if you mull around, if you saw who raised their hands, and I'll have you stand up again at the end of the program, you can go talk to some of these people because you'll see how meaningful it is. And Suzanne is putting together a trip and taking the leadership to put together a trip, a top-notch trip, just like she went on, for people in the community, and we're going to open it up, and I don't think we're going to have any problem getting 20 people. This is going to be in April. We were just talking about the itinerary. So in terms of the intellectual Iron Dome, one thing we have to understand is that on the intellectual side of it, we have to understand what's intellect. And one of the things I learned, I took a couple sessions of Krav Maga. And after 2 sessions, I realized someone was going to get hurt here. It was probably going to be me. So that's why I realized that thank God I have a black belt in speaking, and I'm going to continue to hone those skills and leave the Krav Maga to other people. But I did learn a couple things, that if you're attacked, your adrenaline starts shooting up and you go into an emotional state. And very important to stay calm and centered and not to lash out. You have to conserve your energy. You have to be very strategic. And it's the same thing when you're in a debate. When someone starts throwing out some of the charges, Israel's a genocide state, it's apartheid, and all these different statements that people are making, and they're absolutely certain, you got to figure out, how do I keep my calm? How do I not get myself engaged emotionally? Because we have two brains. We have an emotional brain, and this is Dan Kahneman, the Israeli, who won the Nobel Prize for Behavioral Economics, wrote this book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And many other people have now written about this. And it's the essential lesson that we literally have two brains. We have one brain, but multiple aspects, these two systems within the brain. And one is an emotional, reactive, impulsive aspect. And we wouldn't be able to survive if we didn't have that. Because sometimes we just need to be able to think quick. And we need to be able to go on automation. Like we're driving a car. If I had to figure out every single time, every move with the car, I'd never be able to get anywhere. Imagine the first time you got behind a wheel. So much of this happens automatically now. So we need to move a lot of our processes into an automated system. And that's very good. But we also need to understand that at times we need to be able to think rationally and strategically. And you can't think emotionally and rationally at the same time. And the essence of Kabbalah and Hasidism talks about this core point. And I'm very involved with Chabad. And I'm not plugging Chabad, I'm just talking about what the Chabad means is that we have three intellectual faculties, Chokmah, Bina, and Das. This is the intellectual framework, and the intellect should lead the emotions. So, and this is the essence of Torah and Talmud and Kabbalah. So when you think about that, when you think about something, and you think something is worthy, that should fill you up with emotions that now drive you, as opposed to emotions. When you feel emotionally charged up, we're searching for rational answers to rationalize the way we feel. So if we're rationalizing, it's not going to be effective. We need to be thinking from a different way. So I just wanted to bring that overall context into play. So here we are. We're talking about, let's talk about anti-Semitism for a second. And what I want to do is, in groups of 3 or 4, or in even groups of 2, person next to you, whoever's right near you, we're going to take 2 minutes, and I want you to discuss, what does anti-Semitism mean? And then I want to take some people from the audience, and you could share for your group what you learned about what anti-Semitism is. I'm going to try to make this a little bit interactive as well, so you're not hearing me speak the whole time. So we're going to take 2 minutes right now and talk about what is anti-Semitism. Okay? So if you could just wrap it up for a second. And okay. So you did such a good job, I'm going to give you 2 more assignments. I want you to choose a group leader from your group who's going to be your spokesperson, who's going to come in the center here. And before you do that, I have a second question for you to answer. So we're going to take another minute in your group. And I want you to answer this question. What is Zionism and anti-Zionism? So talk amongst yourselves. Zionism and anti-Zionism, we're going to take 2 minutes for that, and then we're going to line up in the middle once you're done with your group. Okay, yep, all right, so now we're going to, if you're your group leader, please come into the middle. We may not have time for everyone, but I want to get, at least, 8 or 9 people if we can.
If you would like to raise your hand as the spokesperson for your group, I'll come over with the mic.
Okay, so our group talked about anti-Semitism, and we said that it's, at its core, blind hatred of the Jews. But then we talked about how it's complex and nuanced because it has evolved and manifests itself in so many different forms that sometimes it's hard for people to understand that what they might be saying is anti-Semitic.
Okay, and did you talk about Zionism?
So we talked about Zionism being the legitimate right of the Jewish people to live in the state of Israel as Israel, not just any land in the land that is Israel. We didn't talk about anti-Zionism.
Okay, anybody on this
In the
side?
back, someone, okay, there you go.
So just to take off the last point, so I think we were talking as a group about anti-Zionism and having a little bit of a debate about what that meant. Because I think we agreed Zionism is about having a safe homeland, but what does anti-Zionism mean? Does anti-Zionism mean, I think we agreed it meant wiping out the state of Israel, which means wiping out the Jews that live in Israel. Does that mean that if someone is anti-Zionist, that they are anti-Semitic, right? And I think that's the debate we were starting to have. Can you separate those two things, right? So that's probably something we, look forward to exploring with the group.
Excellent, thank you. And Dan was also just back from Israel. Thank you, Dan, for your mission.
Do you want me to ask another?
There was some in the back, I think.
Sure.
I am so not a public speaker, and oh my God, I hear my voice. I get very nervous. Anti-Semitism, we discussed, really transcends various different categories. Judaism actually is an ethnicity, it is a race, it is a religion, it is a peoplehood. So anti-Semitism is actually hatred of all. I'm losing my thought, I'm sorry.
You're doing a great job, by the way.
Thank you.
The last person who complained they couldn't speak that I was reading about was this guy Moses a couple parshas ago. So he ended up doing well for himself, so you're doing great.
And in Judaism, we have a trinity, just like there's a trinity in Christianity, and it is the people, the land, and the book. The three cannot exist without one. So they're very, very intertwined. And so when you talk about anti-Zionism, which is the modern form of anti-Semitism, it's actually, I think, an acceptable form of anti-Semitism, where they're able to separate the land from the people, and it really cannot be. It's also, I'm shaking, I'm sorry. It's also, I think, after World War II, became a very easy way for when people were afraid to admit that they were Jewish, they could say, I'm Jewish, but I'm not a Zionist. It's very easy to hate Jews by calling them Zionists. And it predates all the way back to the story of Hanukkah, which is the first documented war of religious freedom, that's how far Zionism dates back.
Beautiful. Let's give her a round of applause. Anybody else? You got one more back there?
So in our group, we talked about the misnomer of anti-Semitism. It's really Jew-hating. And it would really be great if people could just call it Jew-hating. Anti-Semitism is anti-Semites, and Palestinians are Semites, and Arabs are Semites, and people in Israel are Semites. This isn't anti-Semitism, this is Jew-hating. And then when we talk about anti-Zion, or Zionism and anti-Zion, part of the thought process was, are we really, and the question was addressed here, are we really trying to separate the concept of anti-Zionism from being anti-Jewish? And I think in some ways, while I respect that they're clearly intertwined, I think sometimes for politics and for a lot of other reasons, we may want to separate the idea of Zionism versus Judaism, so that people who say that the president isn't doing things right doesn't mean that all Jews are terrible and should be hated, so that we can separate those things and make them individual, just like if you don't like the president in this country, it doesn't make every American terrible.
All right, well said. Well said. Okay, so that's great for now. So I just want to see by show of hands here. So how many people think that anti-Semitism is a form of Jew hatred? Right, okay, great. So, you know, I watched this incredible video of the late Rabbi Sachs, Jonathan Sachs. And what Jonathan Sachs taught me was that the garden variety of Jew hatred is not anti-Semitism per se. It's xenophobia. The fear of the other is xenophobia. So that's why you could have a fear of Muslims, fear of blacks, fear of Asians. And we talk about fighting hate. It's a form of xenophobia. And again, I'm not saying it's not a huge problem. But if that's the issue, in other words, it's important for us to try to identify, what are we talking about? Are we talking about anti-Semitism? Or are we talking about Jew hatred? Because if it's hatred, education can work to sensitize people to your plight. For example, if someone hates Jews and you have Holocaust training, and then they realize, wow, Jewish people really went through a lot, I had no idea, I was insensitive to this. Now you're being sensitized, and now you don't have that hatred, because you're coming from a more sensitive place. And so, an aspect of anti-Semitism is the Jew hatred, but it comes from a deeper place. And what it comes from this is that when life is not going right for people, and we all do this, when something's not going right, the human nature is to blame. Someone's at fault. Someone's at fault. And we all do this. We're all blaming different things not going right. You know, they don't have a kosher meal for me on the airline, and you know, the plane's running late, and all these things. It's totally natural. But for people whose lives really aren't going well, and they believe society is going down a wrong way, they're looking who to blame. And the Jew gets blamed. I mean, other people get blamed, but through the last 2,000 years, the Jew gets blamed. And there's a belief that there's a force behind the world or their lives that are literally controlling what's happening. And it's a conspiracy theory. And anti-Semitism, at its heart, isn't conspiracy theory. And if people literally think that the Jew is behind the scenes controlling the puppets, and that they're not in control of their life because of this unseen force, the Jew, now you're not just talking about hatred that can be cured by character development. You're now talking about a poisoning of the mind, a defect in the mind. And once you have a defect in the mind, it's a form of brainwashing and a belief system that you no longer have control of your life. This starts becoming dangerous. And as people start aggregating together with this belief system, it becomes more and more dangerous. And it could take over a whole society, as we saw in Germany in the 1930s, is that literally took over and possessed people and intelligent people, right? So people say that anti-Semites are stupid. Some of the smartest people throughout history have been anti-Semites. So it has nothing to do with stupidity. It could actually be super smart people. The Nazis who orchestrated the final solution, and I was in Wannsee in that room. They had PhDs and legal degrees. This was like the best and the brightest who held these conspiracy-based feelings, and they really believed it. This is not like, we're just using this as cover. They really believed that the Jew was behind the evil of the world. And because they believed that, they believed that it would be necessary for the sake of the benefit of the world to eradicate the Jews. It's terrifying, but we know this from history. This is the building blocks of the Holocaust. So if we're dealing with people who have this, we have to understand that education alone is not going to solve it. We have to understand that this is a failure of critical thinking and an ability to discern the facts and apply those facts in an analytical way and challenge assumptions. And when a society becomes filled with anti-Semitism, that's why they say it always starts with the Jews and never ends with the Jews. It never works out for the society. If anti-Semitism gets to a critical, deadly point, past a certain point, not only are the Jews in trouble, but that society is doomed. We went to Spain. We learned about Portugal. We learned about, of course, the Spanish Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition. Those countries have not recovered. They have just not recovered. Europe has not recovered from the loss that was incurred during the Holocaust. So that's why we often say to elected leaders and world leaders and diplomats, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. Anti-Semitism is a societal problem that will destroy your society. That's why you need to partner with us to understand its roots and to start fighting it with us. And that's what's critically important. And we've been fortunate. One other thing I would say about America, as you were talking, Rabbi, about America, and some European countries as well, is that the anti-Semitism takes an irredeemable turn when it's perpetuated by the government. A government that's perpetuating anti-Semitism is a very, very dangerous situation. So thank God, so far in America and in a lot of Western nations, the leadership is committed to fighting anti-Semitism. And that's very, very important. So we have our municipal leaders against anti-Semitism. It's an AJC campaign where we've got literally over 100 municipal leaders here on Long Island and thousands throughout the country, and mayors and governors and people who've signed off to say that we're committed to fighting anti-Semitism. And this is an incredibly important thing, that we have the leadership. And that's why I'm very proud to be part of AJC, because we strengthen the bonds between civil society and Jewish society and our leadership to make sure they stay firm and committed to understanding what is anti-Semitism and where they need to draw the boundary. So I want to go a little bit of a deeper dive now into anti-Semitism for a second, which is that there's all these definitions. We have the International Holocaust Alliance definition, which AJC really pushes municipalities, elected leaders, government agencies, sports leagues, businesses to adopt this definition. In order to fight anti-Semitism, we need a definition, and it's very problematic when you don't have it. So on the night of Yom Kippur, in a city in Germany, someone said, "Down with the Jews," took a kerosene bottle and threw it through the stained glass window. A woman in France was beaten and set on fire and killed with someone saying, "I hate the Jews." In both instances, the court said that wasn't anti-Semitism. It was political protest against the state of Israel. So you sit astounded, like, if that's not anti-Semitism, what's anti-Semitism? So this is why we need the definition. But I'm going to give you a simple definition for purposes of what I think it really comes down to. And anti-Semitism really comes down to 3 Ds. And the 3 Ds are this. It's demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. So if you see these 3 Ds, you're probably dealing with anti-Semitism. So demonization, what's that? It says that the Jew is subhuman. They're evil, they're pernicious, they're not human. They're subhuman and superhuman at the same time. And you could say, how could something be subhuman and superhuman? If something's subhuman, you wouldn't be afraid of it. Well, think about if you were sitting having a lovely dinner in your house, and all of a sudden, a cockroach started crawling across your kitchen table, you'd be freaked out. I can see my wife here, she's freaked out just thinking about it. You'd be freaked out. But of course you're superior to the cockroach. You're not worried about the cockroach, but you're terrified of it. So it's subhuman and superhuman at the same time. And the same thing if you saw a mouse or a rat. And of course, no wonder, when you see cartoons about Jews, anti-Semitic, it's showing Jews as rats or cockroaches or vermin, subhuman. And something subhuman, like a cockroach, you see it, you kill it. So we talk about the 10 Commandments, and you sit back and you think about these 10 Commandments, and you'd say, some of these are just like, duh. Like, do we really need to hear, thou shalt not kill? And then the answer is like, yeah, we do. It's scary. So how do you justify thou shalt not kill? Because you say it's not a human. I'm not killing a human. I'm just killing a cockroach or a rat. So you see the demonization. You see the delegitimization, where you don't have a proper right to speak up. We see this starting to happen with respect to the far left, with some of the DEI movement and the Jews are oppressors. And Jews they're not legitimate. They don't have a right to complain about anti-Semitism because they're in the power class. Or Israel is not a legitimate state. Israel stole the state from the Palestinians. Or the Europeans just gave it to the Jews because they felt guilty about committing the Holocaust. It's not a legitimate state. You're not really legitimate. So this is a delegitimization. Jews have been facing this delegitimization for 2 millennia. You're not really legitimate. You don't really belong. You're interlopers. Brett Stevens talks about this brilliantly. And the third, and maybe none of you have heard about this, but double standards. How many of you heard about the double standards? Right? Anyone who knows the initials UN understands double standards. Israel is held to a standard that nobody else is held to. Nobody. It's mind-boggling how Israel is singled out like no other country. More human rights violations, criticisms of Israel than China, Russia, North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran, on and on and on, every other country put together. The only democratic state with minority protections, a vibrant economy in the Middle East, a vibrant society, that's the society that's being treated as a double standard. And so, and we, of course, we see this, again, we saw this with the college presidents at Harvard and MIT and Penn, that people chanting from the river to the sea, which is a genocidal call. River to the sea is a genocidal call, that there should be no Jews from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. It's a genocidal call. And they weren't sure if that was anti-Semitism, but if there was a call in the United States for no blacks east of the Mississippi, there would be no mistake that would be racism. Or for gays, whatever. That's a double standard. And we're facing this double standard. Now, the anti-Semitism is built on 3 M's. The 3 Ds are built on 3 M's. And the 3 M's are myths, misinformation, and manipulation. So there's an incredible book by an Australian by the name of Alex Rivchin, who came and spoke in Jim's house. We had an AJC program about 1.5 years ago. And he wrote this book called The 7 Myths of Anti-Semitism. And it really explains the architecture of how anti-Semitism has morphed and evolved over the last 2,000 years. And the myths, from the Jews killed Jesus to the they killed babies for matzah, that they poison the wells and they control the economic system, all these myths, and they morph and they change. And it's really quite extraordinary how these myths have continued to exist. We have a Jewish Black coalition, and we work very, very closely with various different communities. We have these different coalitions. And just before COVID, in November of 2019, we held it in Atlanta at the Martin Luther King Center. And we partner very closely with the Martin Luther King Center, and AJC was the major Jewish organization through Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Martin Luther King during the 60s. AJC has been around since 1908. They provided the critical research that the Supreme Court cited in Brown versus Board of Ed, that separate was not equal. And Martin Luther King saw himself as a true partner with the AJC, and he spoke at our annual conference in 1964. And he, on record, was a very proud Zionist. And he said, someone who doesn't believe the Jewish people should have their own state is an anti-Semite. That was Martin Luther King. Anyway, we heard from some of our partners, from black ministers in small towns in the Deep South, that there's numerous churches that are still saying that the Jews killed Jesus. And, of course, we know this is going on. So these things are very pernicious. We got these myths, so we have to understand what the myths are. And again, a lot of this is not rational. That's part of conspiracy theory. It's not rational. It's illogical. A conspiracy theorist is able to hold 2 things in their mind at the same time. And it's very, very rigid. So there was this guy who is convinced that he's dead. So goes to his therapist, says to the therapist, I'm dead. So the therapist says to him, nope, you're not dead. He's like, nope, I am. Guaranteed I'm dead. So they have their session. He comes back a couple sessions later. The therapist is really trying to figure out what to do here. The guy's pretty determined that he's dead. So he thinks, and he says to the patient, he said, do dead people breathe? And he said, no, they don't. He said, okay, I want you to pay attention right now. I want you to watch your breath and tell me, are you breathing or not? And I closed his eyes, takes a few breaths, and he said, I was wrong. Dead people do breathe. And this is a little bit of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with this craziness whatever you try to get through, it's the same answer. It's the same, you get to the same answer. And so we have to understand what we're dealing with. And of course, misinformation, things are spread. What's an example of misinformation? That Israel bombed a hospital and killed 350 people in Gaza. And the media flows in condemnations, million people protesting in Turkey, in the Arab world. It was all misinformation. It just wasn't true. Eventually, the news media realized it's not true, and they put their apology in a little footnote, and nobody cares. But this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with misinformation, and it's rampant. And then we're dealing with manipulation, which is a form of misinformation, where things are manipulated to make it seem that it's something, but it's a lie. And with artificial intelligence, this is getting more real, much more real. And with the spread of social media, of course, it could spread like wildfire. So this is what we're dealing with anti-Semitism. And again, it's important to be aware and start having the understanding. So what I was talking about is, and I'm talking about anti-Zionism now. So Zionism, as many of you mentioned, was coined by who? Who knows who was the founder of Herzl, Theodor Herzl, right? And, he was like he worked for a newspaper. He happened to be in France, and he didn't have much interest in the Jewish people. He wasn't that really actively engaged, and then all of a sudden he saw the Dreyfus affair. This great Admiral Dreyfus, who's now being totally humiliated, and he's like, okay, if this could happen in France, the Jews are not safe anywhere. And then he framed the idea that the Jews needed their own homeland, Jewish homeland for the Jewish people. It's the only way we're going to be safe. And people thought he was nuts. 1897 or 1898, the Zionist conference, he said, we will have our own country in 50 years from now. And he died at a young age, but he got the ball rolling. He was quite a visionary. And I bring up Herzl for a couple reasons. Number one, as a Jew, we can't despair, because this is bad news. But we can't despair. And if you look back at Jewish history, and I'm asking myself the same question, and I come to a certain conclusion. It's not possible that we survived. It's not possible. I mean, now we have the state of Israel, we have a strong country, but think about, we were in Europe. We didn't have guns, we had no arms, we're living in the shtetl, we're living in the cities. And when the authorities decided it was time to get rid of the Jews, there we were gone. England, France, Spain, Portugal, North Africa, we were gone. We're pretty powerless. And we somehow survived. It's amazing. So, and you see how Israel came into being and survived 48, 67, 73. All these things are extraordinary. 2 weeks ago, I was fortunate, we co-hosted a program with General David Petraeus out in Oyster Bay. I don't know, was anyone here, anyone at that program? You weren't there. So, and I was fortunate, I was in a VIP room with him for about a half hour with 3 former members of Congress, and he was giving a inner briefing. And then he shared some of the comments to the main group. And he said, and he studied war. He's one of the foremost experts in the world on the history of war. And he had just written a book of modern warfare, 1945 to Ukraine. And brilliant, brilliant guy. And he said that nobody really fully understands how close Israel came to being eradicated in 1973. They were totally, completely caught off guard. And it was it was a huge cost to Israel, but the fact that they were able to regain and fight back was extraordinary. And that, he said, is studied at West Point and military academies throughout the entire world. But anyway, the point is, we survived. All these miracles of how we survived. So we have to understand that there's a higher power. We have God. It's a higher power. We have to do our part, and amazing things are going to happen. And that's really what's happened. And we talk about last week's Parsha, and we talk about Moses before. God says, I'm going to split the sea. I want you to take your staff and point your staff this way. So Moses didn't have to do much. He pointed his staff, and all of a sudden the sea splits. But he needed him to do something. And during the fight with Amalek, he had to keep his arms up in prayer. And if his arms came down, the Israelis started losing. When his arms went up, they were successful. So we have to do our part. We have to understand there's a role we have to play, but there's also a bigger force that's happening. And going to what the rabbi was saying, it is each of us has to be engaged and involved. Each one of us. We have to finish by 11, is that right? Yeah. So each one of us has to be engaged and involved. And this is the most important thing. We're each a leader. We each have to unlock our inner Moses, find our voice. I used to be terrified to speak in public, to shake like a leaf. And I learned how to become a speaker. But each one of us has an important voice, an important role, whether it's speaking or whether it's contributing, it's helping people, whatever it is that we're doing, we have to get into the game. And the fact that you're here, you're in the game. But there's a lot of people who are home now and in your zone of influence, and each one of you needs to be a leader in your zone of influence to bring people, as I say, into the stadium. We went to Madison Square Garden to a Knick game last week with two of my kids, and I realized there's 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden. There's 50 people who are involved in the game, the players, the coaches, the refs. And there's 7 billion people outside of Madison Square Garden. So Jewish world, you got 15 million Jews. So we got to get the Jews that are outside the stadium into the stadium, buy a ticket, come to programs like this, get involved, find out how you could make more of an impact. And those are in the stadium. How do we get you onto the court? To meet with elected officials, to meet with businesses, to advocate to universities, school boards. And the ability that we have to make an impact is quite enormous. Okay, so one thing that we're going to talk about now is, as I said, not every thing someone throws at you do you have to shoot down. So at the Petraeus event, I walk out, and there's a guy with a sign, big sign, and he's like screaming, Israel's committing genocide. Israel's committing genocide. And, of course, it activated my inner emotional self, as I was talking about beforehand, and I wanted to go over there and tell him what an idiot he was. But then I realized, that's not going to be a good use of my time. I'm not going to convince him because he's turned himself into a human parrot. That's what he is. And parrots are fun, they're cute, and you could train them to say certain things, but you can't get them to think. So if someone's acting like a parrot, you're probably better off not engaging them. And there are people that all of you probably come across. They've already got it all figured out. They've got it figured out. They're absolutely certain, and nothing you're going to do is going to change their mind, and all you can do is get into an argument with them. So you have to figure out when is it worth getting into an engagement with them, and when isn't it? And then if you're going to get in an engagement with them, how do you engage in a way that could potentially move the ball forward? And one of the things I learned when I went through diplomatic training was that two sides start here. The goal is not to get to yes. We read get to yes. That's not the goal on the first. The goal is take a step closer. Another step closer. It's like going on a first date. The goal on that first date is not to get married. The goal is to get to know the person. So when you're interacting with another human being who has a different perspective, to ask some questions. Again, if you think it's someone who's important in your life, why do you feel the way you feel? Acknowledge the way they feel. Acknowledge that this must be scary and upsetting. are you open to hearing a different perspective? Here's how I see it. You try to have a civil conversation. We can go through some of these exercises in the next session of this class, but I'm just giving you a little taster for right now. And one of the things I want to talk about, too, is, as I was referring to before with the blaming and the anti-Semitism, is that there's a thing called the victim archetype in psychology. And the victim archetype, and it's very important because we see this, you're going to see this playing in your lives. You're also going to see it playing in a global sphere. So the victim mindset is this. Someone feels like they're a victim, and there has to be two other roles. Otherwise, this whole archetype collapses. There has to be a perpetrator, and there has to be a savior. So you got the victim, the perpetrator, and the savior. If you pull out any one of those three, the whole thing collapses. Now, the problem with the victim mindset is that it's very emotionally compelling, and it's very ineffective to getting what you want. Very ineffective. So, in the Palestinian situation, the Palestinians are victims, the Israelis and their supporters are perpetrators, and the Arab extremists or the liberal college students, the liberal West is the savior. And that's the dynamic. And that enables it to continue to perpetuate. And it's not helping the Palestinian people at all. And people don't realize this. So one of the tasks that I've had in the last few years, I spent some time in Germany talking with the German government, including the people within the German government who are responsible for the Israel policy. And I pointed this out. I said, is your aid to the Palestinians helping the Palestinian plight in any meaningful way? Let's just, aside from the fact that this is not fair to Israel, let's say we couldn't care less about Israel. Is your aid and your condemnation of Israel every time they protect themselves after Hamas fires rockets, is that helping the Palestinian people? And I was able to get them to realize, no. And when you criticize Israel, you're helping the people or you're helping the leaders who are in charge who are not helping their Palestinian people. And they understood it's really helping the leadership. And I had the same success in France and many others working on this issue. And at the end of the day, it's not even trying to prove Israel's right. Because I may not win that argument, but at least I could win the argument. If you really care about the Palestinian people, what are you doing? Are you really helping? I think we see a huge sea change now within the European world and amount of aid that they're throwing to the Palestinians and seeing it's not helping. So anyway, so if you get into conversation with people, and we'll go through some of the myths, you'll often see it's around this structure, right? Israel's a genocide state. Well, they're the perpetrator. The victims are the people of Gaza. And they're looking for, and they're the savior, right? The kids who are telling you that, they're in the moral high ground thinking they're the savior. And they're absolutely certain of their position, although they know very, very little. By the way, one other little hint when you're talking to someone. Anecdotally, I believe there's a direct inverse relationship between how certain someone feels and how right they are. The more you're certain, the more I'm certain you're wrong. And I see this, I've done this with my kids. I guarantee you the Islanders are going to beat the Rangers. Okay, I'll take the bet. I guarantee, but okay, great. Whatever you're guaranteeing, I'm going to take the opposite bet. Because I'm getting 50-50 odds and they're going to be wrong like 80% of the time. Because the certainty clouds the ability to see what's really going on. Okay, so I want to take a little pause here because it's 8:30 and we're going till 9, correct? Is that right? What time did we say? 9, right? 9, okay. So what I want to do is, I have a lot more content, but I want to hear from you a little bit. Questions that you have. Specific questions, and we have the mic here, and I'll try to answer some of the questions, and then we could cover some more of the material through the questions.
Hello? Yeah. So I kind of disagree with you a little bit respectfully. I'm so sorry. But when I look on TV all over the world at these crowds, thousands of people protesting against Israel, these pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas protests, you can't not address that and say, well, I can't deal with the crowd. I have to take one person at a time. I know that sounds great, but what's going on in the world right now, this isn't new. We've actually talked about this for a long time. I think for the past 10 or maybe even 15 years, the Islamic regime, and I don't know what else to call it, so I'm calling it that, they've infiltrated the government, they've infiltrated the colleges, they've already poisoned the minds of our American students, whether they're Jewish, Christian, or whatever. So how can we just fight that by saying, okay, we're not going to address the crowd? This drives me nuts.
Okay, great question. Let's take a couple questions at the same time, and then I'll bunch them together.
What are our sources of actual facts? So, for example, talking to liberal, Jewish, pro-Israel people I know who are now believing that 26,000 Palestinians were massacred by Israel and only 1,200 Jews were hurt. So only 1,200. So Israel is doing the genocide, not the Arabs, not the others. Where do you find facts to understand and be able to, as you said, the intellectual Iron Dome? How do you fight? How do you combat those factual things? What are the sources?
Okay, great. We'll take one more question for now, right up here.
I would like to say that there's a difference between a war and a genocide. Genocide is the intended action of wiping out an entire people. So when we mix up genocide with what's going on in Gaza, that's already a problem, calling it genocide. But I do think, and I think, I believe many people here do feel upset about the number of innocent people being killed in this war. As Jews, we don't like to be the perpetrator, right? We don't like to be the ones that are causing hurt and problems to other people. Having said that, supporting Israel and knowing that Hamas is evil has put us in a very difficult position. At least that's how I feel personally. And my interest, if you have an answer, is how do we rationalize these two different feelings, which is very difficult. Support of Israel, and at the same time, feeling that many innocent people are being killed.
Okay, great. And we'll go for another round in a minute. Great points, everyone. So, with the question with respect to the thousands of protesters and, Islamic influence within the university system in the United States, I would say, we are addressing it. The question is, how do you address it in the most strategic way possible? So with respect to the thousands of protesters, we're not going to be able to speak to these protesters and influence them. Minds have been poisoned for generations. It's frustrating, but we're not going to be able to, I think, win that battle with the resources we have. We are grossly outnumbered. Grossly outnumbered. So we have to figure out how we could be strategic. That's why we focus very much on the leadership. When I spoke at a rally in Oyster Bay, I acknowledged our town supervisor and all the leaders there. I said, I'd rather have one of you than the million protesters in Turkey. Because that's what the decisions are being made. What the leadership of the United States, and particularly Congress, supporting Israel is of utmost importance. So we have to understand where we could win and we can't win. That being said, this is the importance of the Abraham Accords. And AJC was on the forefront for 20 years of creating the circumstances that helped enable the Abraham Accords. And part of that was, and Suzanne and I went as part of a high-level delegation to Morocco as part of that in 2017. And understanding that the government had serious needs to advance their economy, to fight terrorism, to create a stable and prosperous future, and understood that the poisoned minds of their people and the failed policies of their government wasn't going to help them. And one of the very few countries that have figured out how to deal with creating a booming economy was Israel. And this is one of the main impetus for the Abraham Accords. And as we engaged the leadership, and that leadership started engaging the population, the educated population, and the Abraham Accord countries started seeing that there was tremendous benefits to be had by going down the road of peace, you started seeing changes taking place. We went to a school for imams in Morocco that based on the Malikite version of Islam, which is very, very peaceful, and the government's made it very clear. Imams who get certified have to be teaching Islam and not politics, and they cannot call for hate. And they're very much clear on what's acceptable and not acceptable of what's being said in mosques and what the government accepts. Again, and you start seeing this stuff moving down and the economies start developing. And it's a long process. We also created this video series called Al Yahud in Arabic. It's called About the Jews. 10 episodes so far. And it's all about the Jews. And it's about the Jews and their relationship with the Arabs. And we were hoping for, in a dream, 100,000 downloads. This was launched 4 years ago. We have had over 100 million downloads in the Arab world, and we know exactly where it's being downloaded. In Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Saudi Arabia, throughout the entire Arab world. And slowly, we're starting to expose people, and the governments are starting to expose people to a different vision of who the Jews are, because the governments are trying to rein in their people. So again, that's a long-winded answer, but there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the Arab world. We have an office in Abu Dhabi, and we're actively involved in fighting this fight. 2 weeks before October 7th, we gave our highest award to Sheikh Abdullah bin Abaya. Sheikh Abdullah bin Abaya is truly one of the giants in the Islamic world. He's considered the foremost expert of Islamic law, and he's a total giant. And he goes through a whole analysis of Islamic law and he's basically sees how any incidence of violence needs to be reinterpreted. Just in the same way the Torah says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and we know from the rabbis it doesn't really mean an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. He's done that in the Arab world, and he's got a tremendous following, and he's created this Institute of Virtue in the United Arab Emirates, which brings together rabbis and priests and the whole religious cycle about helping go beyond human rights to human dignity and supporting each other. I mean, he's an older gentleman right now, but it was just incredibly inspiring, some of the work that's happening. And as you might imagine, he is on the extremist most wanted list. There is, a fatwa against him, but he's fearless. And there's other people, like right after October 7th, AJC helped this woman who's very, very influential in Egypt, who said Israel has a right to defend themselves. And the mob, we got intelligence that the mob was coming after her and told her to get on the next flight to wherever the heck it was going. And we got her to the United States. She's now under protection in Washington, D.C., and she spoke with us. And it's amazing. And there's a lot of people in the Arab world who are starting to think of things differently. So I'm very hopeful with that. As far as the university situation, we're challenging it. We're bringing light to it, and it's the teachers are much worse, and this is part of it. And we have a thing called Project Interchange, where we bring leaders, civil society, to Israel to see for itself. We've brought over 100 college presidents and chancellors, now vice chancellors we're bringing, people in charge of academic affairs, and it becomes very influential. Like, one of the people that we brought was the chancellor of Syracuse, where my son went, and Syracuse has become a good ally, and virtually every person we bring, they come back and they're like, wow, this is not what we, what we expected. This is not what we expected. So again, we're fighting the fight, and I think there's some real victories and there's some real challenges. And going back to the resources, that's why, because we're outnumbered, we need every single person engaged. Okay, on the other question, how to combat sources of fact, of what's true and what's not true. So whenever I'm debating with someone, I'm saying to them, and this is the same thing with my kids, whatever I say is true. So just ask me, I'll tell you. No, but all kidding aside, look, people put themselves into an information bubble, and they get stuck in that bubble, and all their information is contained in that bubble, and they think that's all that there is. There's not so, I mean, I know people whose kids actually believe that that no Israelis were kidnapped, no Israelis were killed. It was made up by Israel as a pretext to go into Gaza. I mean, people think that. I mean, like, people still think that. I said, people still think that the tooth fairy is real. And there's always some in the audience who's like, they're not? But no, tooth fairy is not real. So, but that, like, how do you deal with that? So the question is the sources. Are you asking, how do I get sources of information that I could rely on? Or how do I get these people to consider other sources of information? For me, sources of information, I get my information from a few different places. First of all, AJC vets huge number of articles, and they feed that in a newsletter every single day with top 10 things you need to know. So that's one briefing that I get. There's some other great sources that provide, very good overviews. I'm also a big fan of the Times of Israel. I think they're very balanced, and I think their coverage is very accurate, analytical. They've got great articles, great op-eds, and that's Times of Israel. It's a big source of mine. And then there's like a lot of think tanks that are pretty credible, and I follow some articles of these think tanks. Like one very prominent, very center, very respected think tank came out with a very, very detailed analysis of the misinformation that Hamas is putting out as to the number of people being killed. And they go through the whole science of it and what's happening and what's reliable, what's not reliable. And, there's these sources out there, and if a kid wants to hear if you want to hear a different perspective, then, you could certainly be exposed to a different perspective. But this comes back to, a core point about how the brain works. What happens is that we have a feeling about something, we rationalize that feeling, we form an opinion. And then we form that opinion, and then we find people who validate that opinion for us. So now we belong to a group. And now we want to feel like we belong. And now we belong to the group. And if you don't hold that opinion anymore, you'll be kicked out of the group. So, very much so, we're driven socially through neurochemicals, particularly through the neurochemical of serotonin, where we want to belong to a group. So it's very difficult to break from that group. And then what happens is your identity is framed around, I'm the person who's standing up for justice. So your identity gets wrapped up with your opinion. So when you're trying to change someone's opinion, you're trying to change their identity, it becomes a huge, huge challenge to do that. So it has to be done a slow process, like deprogramming someone in a cult, because that's a lot of what we're dealing with. Okay. Your comment about the genocide, spot on, that what it isn't genocide. So, the question is, if I understand your question correct, how do we fight against the untruthful, defamatory claim that Israel's creating genocide, and at the same time be legitimately concerned by the fact that there's thousands of innocent Gazans who have been killed and are in harm's way. And I think and as you said, I think as you said, as Jews, of course we feel terrible. We don't want to see this happening. And we certainly don't want to see this happening where it's from our bombs and our people. And I think that from the briefings that I've gotten, what I've seen is that and again, some of you won't agree with this, but every single innocent person who's been killed in Gaza has been killed because of Hamas. If Hamas had not gone in on October 7th, all these people would be alive. Number two, Hamas has specifically embedded themselves with civilian population, have clearly made it, this is not on record, not our responsibility for taking care of the people. That's the job of UNRWA. And we are, and that's what we're facing. And then Israel comes in, and we host Israeli kids as part of the Israeli Shinshin program. We're hosting for years, and a number of those kids are in very elite units. They tell us what's really going on. They're calling up to say, hey, we're going to bomb your building, get everyone evacuated. We're going to drop the knock bomb. Here's this thing. We're going to leaflets, pamphlets, warnings. No nation, and General Petraeus said this, no nation in the history of the world has ever faced a more complex battlefield and performed in such a humanitarian way as the Israelis have. That's General Petraeus. So I think it's just understanding that core point. So anyway, we've run out of time here. We want to do, again, I hope you found this helpful. The next session, I want to get into real workshop-y stuff where, just like you ask the questions, where you're challenged. You're faced with a challenge. Someone tells you, Israel's an oppressor state. How do you respond? Uber driver doesn't pick you up at your home because you have an Israeli flag. What do you do? Very practical, engaging people and dealing with these things. So Eric is going to come on up, and thank you all very much for listening.
So good evening, everybody. I'm just going to be a minute. My name is Eric Post. I'm the Long Island Regional Director for the American Jewish Committee. 6.5 years. I got married right here. I showed my wife a picture of where we were, and it was a nice recollection. I wanted to thank Wendy and the committee of several people who put tonight's event together, who really worked hand in hand with Arnie on the messaging and the pamphlet and everything going into it. A lot of work, and it's very much appreciated. Rabbis Ben Gideon and Rosenthal, thank you for hosting us. And really to thank Arnie, it's nice having a board member / immediate past president who can carry the message not only of your organization, but current policies and introducing a new way of thinking about the conflict, about anti-Semitism. And I think tonight we only got a little bit of a snippet of the way Arnie thinks about, the Iron Dome, and I think there's a lot more to come. So we appreciate that. I also want to recognize our current president, Jim Neuwirth, who's here. And all our board members, if you could stand up. I know we have 4 or 5 board members here. Okay, great, thank you. And I wanted to just tell you a very little bit about a conference that we have coming up June 9th to the 11th in Washington, D.C. It's called the Global Forum. I have a short 50-second video that I'm going to show, and then just tell you a couple things about it. And if you have questions, anybody who stood could tell you more about it. So here's our video. So there's more information outside on the table by the coat room. And if you have have questions about Global Forum, it's Sunday to Tuesday, the 9th to the 11th of June. It's a lot of plenaries, large plenaries, where you have 2,000 people plus. This year, I'm sure it'll be even more, from 70 to 80 countries, Jewish leaders. We bring along a large delegation from Long Island. So we have these large plenaries with elected officials, with diplomats, et cetera, who are speaking to us. And then we have breakout sessions of smaller groups that may be conversations between media and AJC professionals and AJC lay leaders, et cetera. And we have a Long Island dinner. It's really a fantastic event. And I know that some other organizations have, pulled back on conferences, et cetera. So it may be a really good opportunity to get to DC with us. You can ask me or any of us for questions. A couple of the other things we do on Long Island, in addition to public programs like tonight, we also have smaller programs. For instance, once you're more involved with AJC, Jim is hosting the Latvian UN ambassador in a couple weeks for Shabbat dinner. We have upcoming programs with other elected officials, ambassadors, et cetera, that happen here on Long Island. We do a lot of programming in New York City as well. Tomorrow night, another public program, if you haven't heard, Temple Sinai, just down the road, is hosting 2 survivors of the Nova Music Festival. So they could sure use the support. I believe that's at 7 o'clock. If you are a student or have students or grandkids or anybody who's in the high school, 9th to 12th grade, we have a program called Leaders for Tomorrow, which we do at the Sid Jacobson JCC once a month throughout the school year. So we're in the middle of our current cohort. We have a lot of students from this area. We also have a Lift Accelerator program. It's like a one-day program for people who are in the program and also particularly people who are not in our program this current year at Schechter School of Long Island on March 10th, which we can send you information about in a follow-up email. We have a lot of action alerts also on our website to free the hostages. One we just put out yesterday because a lot of cities around the country are, thank God, not on Long Island, but are passing resolutions to adopt a ceasefire in Israel. And you can, one click, can send a message to the governor, both senators, our soon-to-be-filled congressman, and your local elected officials as well, state senate, state assembly. So you can do that as well at ajc.org/takeaction. So we'll be here afterwards, our board members and myself. We'd love to have you more engaged in what we're doing. And I think Wendy wants to come up and close out the program.
I would just like to take a moment to thank Rabbi Rosenthal for introducing this evening's program, and thank you to Rabbi Ben Gideon and Sharon and the Social Action Committee for their commitment. A special thanks to Cindy Feldman, who was passing around the microphone, and Linda Leibovitz, who worked very hard to bring this important program to us. But above all, I would like to thank Arnie Hers for the wonderful, inspiring, and educational presentation, and for all the work that AJC is doing to help fight anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, I would also like to say how sorry I am that Arnie had to be here tonight. As a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, I grew up knowing how horrible it was to be a Jew in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe in the 30s and 40s. I grew up loving America and being thankful for all that it did to save the multitude of Jews that lost everything during the Second World War. Never did I ever imagine that one day I would be concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism throughout the world, and especially right here in America. What history tells us is that we cannot sit idly by and wait for it all to go away. We need to be prepared. We need to know what we can do about it. Arnie began this conversation this evening, and I hope will come back to join us again and teach us exactly what we can do to help fight this uprising in anti-Semitism. On behalf of the Social Action Committee of Temple Beth Shalom, I want to thank you for being here this evening. And of course, thank you again, Arnie. We look forward to continuing to work with you in AJC to make a difference. If any of you would like to join the Social Action Committee in this work, I welcome you. Please just call the office. They will give you our contact information. We need each and every one of you to work and to really make a difference. We are also a Jewish institution. So on that note, I will invite you all outside for a cup of coffee and a nash. And I thank you all for being here. Thank you very much. Good night.